Good evening and welcome to this Bright Blue Ludgate Lecture, named after Ludgate Circus, home of Bright Blue. Those who don't know us, Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. I'm its chair, Sarah Sands. Today be giving you substantial food for thought before everyone just hits the place. Very pleased, therefore, to welcome Jonathan Hall, QC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation appointed by the Home Secretary. Jonathan is a barrister in an independent practice with specialisms in policing, national security, extradition, and international about all those subjects. He published his report on multi-agency working following the terrorist attack at Fishmongers. The subject of his Ludgate lecture is what are the threats to the UK? This date is sombre, the anniversary of the 7/7 bombings in July 2005. Central London. Nobody could forget the images of that terror. When I spoke to Jonathan in advance of this lecture, I asked the unsophisticated question, has the pandemic hindered terrorism or changed it? Jonathan talked of the strange new patterns emerging, perhaps reflecting our society and our times. Some terrorism never changes, elsewhere it takes on new forms. It will be fascinating to listen to Jonathan speak. Next half hour, I will then briefly pick some of his themes, crack on with questions from the audience. Submit your questions to Slido, the Bright Blue team will pass them across to you. Live tweeting this event using the hashtag Bright Blue and live streaming it on the Bright Blue YouTube channel. Jonathan, welcome, and please begin.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to assume, unless someone tells me otherwise, that you can hear me okay. So what is the threat in the UK today? As Sarah said, today is the 16th anniversary of 7/7, and I still vividly recall the evidence at the inquests of Peter Clarke, who was the head of Police Counter-Terrorism Command. The inquests revealed that Mohammed Sadiq Khan, who was the ringleader of the 7/7 attacks, had been detected at the fringes of an earlier plot in 2004, and this was the plot to blow up Blue Water Shopping Centre in Kent, plus the Ministry of Sound nightclub, plus London synagogues with a fertiliser or fertiliser-based bombs. Mr. Clarke explained how a decision was taken to let, as they said in the parlance, the operation run, to allow it to progress until there was the strongest possible evidence of an actual terrorist plot, rather than carrying out early disruptive arrests. It involves the authorities covertly switching the fertiliser for the bomb with an inert substance. The reason for letting it run was that the authorities wanted a conviction to prove to the general public the nature of the Islamist terrorist threat in the country, and to get a conviction, they needed to persuade a jury that the plot was real and deadly serious, and 4 individuals were ultimately convicted and sentenced to life. How things have changed. Very few people today need proof that there is an Islamist terrorist threat. But if you ask me about the threat today, compared to only a few years ago, I would say the threat is becoming more blurred. I don't mean that in some way the threat is not real, simply that there are more cases in which it is harder to distinguish between what is conventionally understood as terrorism and what is not. Crudely speaking, there are 2 factors behind this blurring, and both factors are profoundly connected to the digitalization of ordinary life. The first factor is the changing impact of real-world terrorist groups. Terrorism legislation was born out of the response to organised political violence in Northern Ireland, and added to the prescribed Northern Irish groups. The most notable banned organisations today are the Islamist terrorist groups Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and Al-Muhajirun, and on the right wing, the terrorist group National Action. These groups have proven themselves to be capable and dangerous with real membership and programmes of action. But the greatest risk of terrorist violence in England and Wales, and note that I exclude Northern Ireland, does not flow from physical groups exercising command and control. It flows from what used to be called lone actors and are now sometimes known as self-initiators. Their involvement with any group or ideology is online. It's probably divorced from family or personal connection, unlike more traditional iterations of terrorism, which is often profoundly based on social or family networks. Because it is online, it's uncomplicated by the need to find a covert place to meet or carry out weapons training. It avoids the possibility of an awkward question from a family member. Where are you going? Who are you meeting? And why on earth are you going out dressed like that? It is uninhibited by the needs of old-fashioned tradecraft when transmitting propaganda or bomb manuals. It is true to say that most completed terrorist attacks, at least on the extreme right wing, are carried out by adults. Think of Thomas Mayer, who murdered the MP Joe Cox, Darren Osborne, who carried out the attacks at the Finsbury Park Mosque, and Vincent Fuller, who stabbed a teenager in a Surrey car park. But we need to talk about children. Take a real example. By early 2020, the individual I'm going to talk about was consuming radical jihadist online material. He was arrested by Hampshire police and then by counter-terrorism police. They found that he had researched explosives and prepared shrapnel bombs using bottles to bring about the end of the Western race, as he put it. He was 14. This sort of arrest is happening at what appears to me to be an astonishing level of frequency. As part of my role, I am notified whenever an individual is detained under terrorism powers, and that allows me to speak to investigating officers to test the investigative temperature. I've lost count of the times that the detainee in a recent arrest has turned out to be a child, and on occasion the rather pathetic information has been conveyed. The child seems to prefer the calm and attention of a specialist terrorism suite to their own home lives. Official statistics, most recently published in June of this year, show that arrests for terrorism-related activity amongst the under 18s were rare in the years 2003 to 2012, about 5% of the total. The rate crept up to a maximum of 6% until March 2020. But in each of the last quarters, ending March 2021, it has been between 10 and 16%. The pandemic dramatically affected the arrest rates for all age categories, but not for the under 18s. Here, the absolute number of arrests went up. Almost half the arrests of under 18s since March 2001 have been in the last 5 years. Now, as it happened, the boy with the shrapnel bombs was acquitted. According to the reports of the trial, there was terrible neglect at home and a desire to be respected and cool. And the jury cannot have accepted that he really intended to carry out acts of terrorism. Did the grisly counter-terrorism police officers, with all their training and experience, and I use the word grisly advisedly, most counter-terrorism investigating officers are still men, did they expect that they would be arresting a 14-year-old boy? No, of course they didn't, but what could they do? They could not sensibly take the view of the priest in Sir Walter Scott's Waverley, who thought that serious ideological violence was excusable owing to youth, misled by the wild visions of chivalry and imaginary loyalty. The problem is that these wild visions may lead to actual violence. Even if lone individuals do not move to violence themselves, they may encourage it in others. It is also necessary to speak about autism. It has not, to date, received much public attention, and there is a real, very real and respectable fear that making any sort of link will lead to stigma. It is quite possible, and this is supported by some of the research, that the relevant factor is autism plus, meaning that for people on the autistic spectrum who are drawn into terrorist violence, there tends to be some additional factor at work, like a very unstable family background or some other cognitive difficulty. But consider these recent cases. In 2018, a 17-year-old boy called Lloyd Gunton was convicted. He declared himself an Islamic State soldier, and he prepared a vehicle and knife attack in Cardiff. He was autistic and he was sentenced to life. In 2019, Jack Reed was convicted. He was involved in occult neo-Nazism and had been since the age of 13 when he planned an attack on Durham synagogues. Autistic, sentenced to 6 years and 8 months. In 2020, 17-year-old Paul Dunleavy was convicted. He was involved in attack planning in the West Midlands, inspired by the terrorist group Foyer Creek Division. He was autistic, sentenced to 5.5 years. And this year, a 16-year-old from Newcastle, who can't be named, who invited support for national action in the interests of creating a white ethno-state, also autistic, was sentenced to a referral order. My understanding is that the incidence of autism and prevent referrals are also staggeringly high. It is as if a social problem has been unearthed and fallen into the lap of counterterrorism professionals. From the point of view of counterterrorism law, is the use of strong powers to detect and investigate suspected terrorism in children justified? I believe it is, because of the risk in some cases to the general public. But is the criminal justice outcome the right one in all cases? Well, consider the offence of possession of material that is likely to be useful to a terrorist. Academics use the word remoteness to draw attention to the fact that having possession of something does not necessarily mean that you are going to do something with it. What about autistic people who simply develop what is called a special interest in this sort of material? Police and prosecutors genuinely fret about whether there is an alternative to arrest and prosecution. So the relationship that today's lone actors or self-initiators have with terrorist groups is an online one. UK legislation is more agile than US legislation in banning terrorist organisations, but the UK is moving towards the edges of what our law allows. The most recent prescriptions of right-wing terrorist organisations such as Sonnenkrieg, Feuerkrieg and Atomwaffen, all undoubtedly inspirers of violent racism, concerned groups that have little, if any, physical presence in the UK. Banning these groups does have intangible benefits. Prescription has a dissuasive effect, it supports online takedowns, and it spreads uncertainty and distrust in terrorism-minded individuals. But it is not possible in law to ban an ideology or a reputation or a franchise. The second factor is the rise of new motivating hateful ideologies. I do not want to minimize the role of Islamist terrorism and traditional right-wing terrorism. But when Lord Lloyd carried out his review that led to the Terrorism Act 2000, which is notable for being threat neutral, the fear over the horizon was of animal rights terrorism and terrorism against abortion clinics. In the event, neither of these causes reached a point at which they were treated as terrorism. Instead, there is now consistent evidence of causes which inspire violence, but which do not superficially appear to be political, religious, racial, or ideological at all. Consider the veneration of US school shootings, most notably the Columbine attacks in 1999. Well, in 2018, two teenage boys from North Yorkshire plotted a Columbine-style shooting and were convicted of conspiracy to murder. They were said to have idolized the Columbine killers and wanted to be anti-heroes. In 2019, Kyle Davies from Gloucester was sentenced to 19 years in prison for attempting to possess firearms and ammunition with the intention of carrying out a mass shooting under the banner Gotterdammerung. He'd carried out extensive research into Columbine, in addition to the Norway attacks by Anders Breivik. Again in 2019, a 21-year-old called Shane Fletcher was convicted of plotting a massacre at a football match in Workington in Cumbria. He too idolized the Columbine shooters. If there is an ideological component to these, and I think there may well be one, it is a nihilism which seeks the end of days. It is something akin to the revolution of the unhappy or the beta uprising carried out by incels or involuntary celibates. The practical impact of this blurring of the lines of terrorist violence is threefold. Firstly, our understanding of terrorist risk must be constantly updated. There are considerable difficulties in identifying whether desires to kill, which are expressed online, particularly when expressed by the young, will in fact translate into acts of terrorism in real life. Cut adrift from groups whose behavior we understand, and from ideologies whose proneness to violence we recognize from bitter experience, we lack the equipment of navigation. Secondly, the tools for addressing violent ideologies before it is too late must be reviewed. It is one thing to employ a theologian to debate the late sermons of Anwar al-Awlaki with a potential Islamist radicalizer. It is another thing to deal with a young, perhaps neurodivergent individual who has become obsessed with accelerationism and the occult. Thirdly, the authorities must continually ensure that terrorism powers and terrorism prosecutions are used against individuals who the public recognise as terrorists. Powerful terrorism laws lose their legitimacy if there are debates about whether the person is really a terrorist at all. Now, so far as a quick tour of terrorism at the moment, because I was an assiduous child at school, I'm going to try and answer the question and try and answer the title of the speech, what is the threat in the UK today? Well, the current threat level in England and Wales has been substantial since February 2021. It went up to severe at the end of 2020 after the attacks in France and Austria. but fears that they would have a galvanizing effect in the UK did not in fact materialize. And the most recent terrorist murders were just over a year ago, the Reading attacks by Kari Sadala. The most likely future attack will be self-initiated, using a bladed or blunt force weapon. And this type of attack, as we know, is difficult to identify and disrupt, and has been promoted by terrorist groups in preference to more spectacular but complex attacks. The greatest risk remains an Islamist terrorist attack, and we are in an era of global uncertainty and potentially an era of less money being available for counterterrorism at home and military action abroad. The pandemic had a temporary suppressive effect because terrorists too have been affected by COVID restrictions and preoccupations. Fewer crowds have meant fewer targeting opportunities, and now crowds are back. The findings of the Manchester Arena inquiry are of dramatic relevance. New laws are likely in connection with protecting crowded places. Whatever laws are enacted, I hope the public are clear-eyed about the trade-offs involved. These are delicate balances. The human rights calculus through which lawyers such as myself attempt to evaluate the necessity and fairness of counterterrorism laws is generally focused on the individual and what could be more precious than the protection of the right to an individual human life. But the collective impact on society matters greatly. In the words of Professor Jeremy Waldron, we need to guard against terrorism leading to a reduction in large-scale social interaction and a marked degradation in the cheerful spirit of security which permeates our society and on which its prosperity depends. Few of us have not experienced the deadening effect of overzealous interpretation of data protection laws on normal social interaction. For example, trying to get a phone number from a school or a sports club. And any protect duty must be carefully apportioned. But looking at locations as well as individuals is a step forward. In my current review of terrorism in prisons, I've been struck by the need to look at the behaviour of whole wings and not just focus on particular individuals. So turning to the four main terrorist categories encountered in the UK today, the threat in Northern Ireland from Northern Ireland related terrorism remains severe. I don't believe the terrorist situation in Northern Ireland is appreciated widely across the UK. In April of this year, the BBC reported 12 days of violence as crowds rioted in towns and cities and attacked the police. Petrol bombs, iron bars, men in masks, a bus hijacked and burned. And that is not to mention the real fear of sophisticated devices made by trained and dangerous professional dissident Republicans. The prevalence of ideological violence and the seriousness of the weapons that are routinely used, such as pipe bombs, is regarded quite differently in Northern Ireland, almost as a fact of life. Northern Ireland has wrestled for decades with how to delegitimise prescribed organisations. In recent years, the highest threat groups, such as the New IRA, have sat at the top, attracting the main counter-terrorism resources of the state. Below them have been groups, mainly but not only loyalist groups, whose interest has turned to drugs and extortion, and they've been referred to as paramilitaries. That's another sort of blurring word, if you like. But that model now looks less stable. All these groups have a knowledge and capability, and a political trigger like the Northern Ireland Protocol can prioritise political goals and political violence over criminal gains. Turning to Islamist terrorism, it's worth considering the arc of Islamist terrorism over the last 20 years or so. Many of our laws have been introduced and revived specifically to deal with aspects of the Islamist threat. Belmarsh detention and then control orders for non-nationals who could not be deported after 9/11. Deprivation of citizenship to deal with individuals who travelled to the so-called caliphate, and temporary exclusion orders to deal with those who have a right to return, and the creation of the designated area offence, on the statute books but not so far used, to dissuade people from travelling in the first place. At the time of 9/11, much focus was on the border areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Individuals would travel from the UK for training at Al-Qaeda camps. Emirs would give their blessings for attack plans carried out in Western capitals or in the air. Now the drawdown of US troops in Afghanistan introduces the possibility that hostile or ungoverned spaces will be exploited once again by individuals who are keen to project a terrorist threat back into the UK. 10 years or so after 9/11, the so-called caliphate was declared in Syria and Iraq, and Daesh, or Islamic State, supplanted Al-Qaeda as the main draw. Right now, there is less travel, but the brands created by both Al-Qaeda and Daesh are still strong. Just 2 weeks ago, the Al-Qaeda media outlet released a speech praising Al-Qaeda activities in the Sahel and the West and Central Africa, encouraging those seeking jihad to travel there. In my first annual report, I referred to the threat of returning jihadis from Iraq and Syria as the dog that didn't bark. In general, that remains the case. Of course, the United States is asking European nations to repatriate their citizens and residents from detention camps. So the question arises about what should be done about Shamima Begum and people like her. As it happened, like my predecessors, I asked the government to be allowed to review the use of immigration and nationality depriving powers when they were used for counterterrorism purposes, but that request was turned down. The answer must be to treat people as individuals. Some individuals will be dangerous and difficult to deal with if they are allowed to return. Others will not. I was disappointed that the Shamima Begum case proceeded all the way to the Supreme Court on stark preliminary issues, and I look forward to seeing how the courts consider the particular factors in her case. Not all returners have proven to be dangerous, but some individuals undoubtedly are. The next point on the arc is the attacks of 2017. These really alerted the authorities to the risk from closed subjects of interest and the width of the pool of individuals who might carry out an act of terrorism. Shortly after that, the 2019 to 2020 attacks in Fishmongers Hall, HMP Whitemoor, and in Streatham placed the focus on offender management, begging the question, what do you do if you've not only caught the terrorist, but prosecuted them and sentenced them? What then? It is interesting to note that the modalities of Usman Khan's original offence were very much of the vintage of the early 2000s, a plot with others to a training camp overseas. His second terrorist offence was redolent of later methods, knives, alone, difficult to detect and disrupt. There are no special terrorism laws to deal with right-wing terrorism. Mostly our laws have proved very adaptable. Membership of a prescribed organisation was rarely prosecuted, but there were 15 offences in the last 5 years of being a member of just a single prescribed organisation, National Action. It is US culture, though, that has an almost total lock on the ideologies of right-wing terrorism in the Anglophone world. Most notable has been James Mason's fascist text Siege, which was systematically injected into the online world by the website Iron March, then the website Fascist Forge, and by the banned US group Atomwaffen. I say almost total. The teenage neo-Nazi Jack Reed used a Twitter handle referring to Oswald Mosley, a rare nod to the homegrown. Where do the online platforms that spread these ideologies operate? More and more, like the platform Telegram, they look for hosting opportunities in less regulated and more permissive jurisdictions such as Russia. The Biden administration has recently adopted a new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, what we would refer to as right-wing terrorism. It is a powerful statement of intent and commitment, although it is opaque on whether and how US laws might be rewritten to allow the banning in the US of domestic terrorist groups. The strategy makes 3 references to the relevance of end-to-end encryption to domestic terrorism. The decision of major US social media companies to push ahead with end-to-end encryption offers great comfort to the spreaders of terrorist hatred across the world. Looking at the position in the US and making a comparison, it is impossible not to be grateful for the UK's tight gun controls. It is thankfully difficult for UK teenagers or adults to replicate the game-orientated kill counts of immigrants or Jews that are being discussed online right now. The most dynamic new category of terrorist activity illustrates the point exactly about blurring. This category is known to investigators and analysts as mixed, unclear, or uncertain. This is a reference to the difficulty of pinning down the ideology rather than the violence with which it is connected. That difficulty shouts from the statistics. In 2019 to 20, over half of the 6,000 or so referrals to Preempt comprised individuals in this category. That means members of the public, many of them in educational settings, extremely worried about overt behaviour which might be terrorist. After weeding out, 351 cases were discussed at a channel panel, and ultimately a total of 127 were adopted at channel cases. This amounts to a 535% increase on 2018-2019, when only 20 of these cases were adopted. For comparison, in 2019 to 20, there were 210 Islamist terrorism and 302 extreme right-wing referrals adopted as channel cases. The 2020 mass killer from Hanau in Germany, Tobias Rathjen, exemplifies the mixed ideology. He was 43, he lived with his parents most of his life. He was openly racist, but obsessed with conspiracy theories involving ritual child abuse. He called himself an incel. He was a loner, not connected to any group. It is impossible to say that he had a single program or ideology. There were plenty of hooks for his hatred. But we don't have to look too far away. I've already referred to school shootings. All the 3 UK plots I've referred to above were inspired, the ones which were inspired by Columbine, also involve profound expressions of race hatred. And of course, there are the recent murders by Daniel Hussein, widely reported in today's media. In conclusion, terrorism remains statistically rare. It was reported yesterday that 21 teenagers have been killed in London this year alone. None of those attacks involved terrorism. The chances are that if you are caught up in violent crime, then almost certainly it will not be a terrorist one. Now the blurring of the terrorist threat means that even identifying a terrorist attack may in some cases be more difficult. So this is what police and Preempt practitioners are dealing with. No doubt new types of violence will either gain acceptance as new forms of terrorism, or perhaps like the fear of animal rights terrorism, will fade out of sight. There is a maturing effect as we learn to see what is in front of us. And that brings me back again to the evidence at the 7/7 inquests. It is possible that we are at a point where our understanding of terrorism and the terrorist threat is going to have to shift once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's so thought-provoking, and the discussion of both this new nihilism of a sort of blurring of what terrorism is, of the actual definition, and of course this sense of these very disturbed young people and how you intervene and in what way. I think talking about, is this a social problem or is it a counter-terrorism problem? And I guess that is outside your remit in that way. But you must have some sort of thoughts of or do you have any idea of sort of why and who you can you hold responsible? You did talk about a little bit about the platforms and the influences that these that young people are susceptible to. Is there anything? Does that come back to the tech companies, or where do you think who needs to intervene?
I think it comes back to tech companies. I looked long and hard during the course of last year whether one should increase the terrorism offences so that it become an offence to possess terrorist propaganda, in effect. And people may not realise, but it's not an offence to have a picture of a jihadi crucifixion or a beheading. It's not an offence to have that. Ultimately, I think the conclusion I drew is that there's so much of this material out there, and it would be a terrible thing to convict so many people as terrorists unless there was some evidence they were actually going to carry out an act of violence. And so I didn't think that was a solution. I think the solution has to be at the macro level, looking at what you can do with online. The online harms bill is obviously a potential way forward. Placing a duty of care on online providers is a way forward, but obviously you're dealing with individuals sometimes who are based, in the Wild West and outside, the UK or even the US. That Daniel Hussein case was really striking today. He clearly did come into Preempt, but the difficulty is Preempt is not set up to deal with every risk. There are many risks of carrying out murder, for example, motivated by race hatred, which won't fall within the category of terror, of Preempt and terrorism. I mean, it obviously is important that one doesn't misuse terrorism laws to try and pick up these dangerous individuals. But I mean, that is what is happening. I mean, police are confronting these social problems. What the answer is, who you hand the risk off to within wider policing, I can't comment on.
And this sense, yes, that these, so you do have now this big increase in very disturbed young people influenced by these platforms. Is there, where do you see that heading? Because, they're going to become adults, and is that a sort of, and is that in any way influenced by the pandemic, or what would make them feel so nihilistic, and why can't they tell the difference between sort of fantasy and truth? What's breaking down? Because in a way, this is more apocalyptic than horrible, but organized, clear, and traceable terrorism.
Well, I wouldn't say apocalyptic, because I mean, actual real world terrorist groups have much greater capability.
Yeah,
they've got better tradecraft. if you look at the ability to make weapons in Northern Ireland, it's nothing like the sorts of weapons that one encounters here. So you shouldn't overstate the degree of the threat. I mean, I think the true problem is that people, particularly people who are neurodivergent, who may find it difficult to make friends, who may be bullied, who may have had really quite an atrocious time if they had an undiagnosed autism, for example, may well find the world of their bedroom and their computer and the familiarity and the sense of belonging that they may get from some of the online voices as much more comforting. And I mean, I'm always wondering to myself, when people talk about, well, is there no intervention that you can do? How do you compete against that? Having a session 1 or 2 hours with someone, how does that compete against closing your bedroom door, finally feeling safe from the world, and doing that day after day and night after night? So it is a problem. I think it is a social problem. I mean, the issue of loneliness is a big one.
And has that been worsened by the pandemic, the fact that people have been separated in that way?
I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. I mean, you know, one can assume it does, but I wouldn't know.
And the other immediate, so you talk about the case today, which seems to sort of illustrate that, you know, the blurred ideology and just sort of hatred. On the other recent issue is obviously our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and does that worry you that that could then become a sort of a rogue state? We're talking about new Chinese influence there, and do you feel, along with Tom Tugendhat, that we've given up our right to influence and that we opened a new danger?
Well, just looking at terrorist risk, I mean, there was that risk, wasn't there, in the 2000s? I mean, I spoke about the AfPak borders and what was going on there. If a terrorist group like the Taliban has control, then there is just the risk that they will use that as an opportunity. I can't comment on what the right choices are, but all I can say is, as a matter of risk, there also certain places in Africa as well are places where you may see people either travelling out or undertaking training, or potentially people coming back into the UK.
And again, I guess that in terms of how that should affect our sort of foreign policy, or, you know, our immigration laws. I mean, are there things that you think might be helpful or make a difference?
Well, I suppose you've got to look at who is coming into the country. I mean, without commenting on who gets to come into the country, obviously there are a large number of people arriving on small boats. So it's important that the authorities have a way of making sure they understand who is coming in and carrying out counter-terrorism threats if necessary. Beyond that, I don't feel I can really comment.
And do you see, I mean, at the moment you talked about the, sort of fragmentation, that the in a way, sort of low grade, terrorism, but that can also, of course, be fatal. It just takes one person with a knife. But do you see a sort of regathering in any way of more organized organizations such as Al-Qaeda, or do you think we're into a whole different landscape now?
Well, National Action was fairly organised. Yeah. I mean, the reason they could be prosecuted for their membership is that they had insignia and membership, I don't know if they had membership cards, but they had real membership, real organisation. I mean, the risk with organisation is easier to detect, and terrorists will no doubt be learning from the early successes that counter-terrorism practitioners had against them. I mean, the spectaculars that one is talking about are obviously harder to organise. They involve communications which may be picked up. They involved groups that may be infiltrated. So I suppose as a matter of technique, it's not surprising that they have pivoted towards the more mundane, the use of knives and blunt force instruments like cars. I mean, whether or not there will be further spectaculars, I don't know.
And you've been talking about sort of definitions of terrorism and how we may have to just rethink all that. I mean, where is cyber fraud? Where's the boundary there on terrorism? You've talked about sort of influence of Russia. Is that, do you count that as part of the terrorist threat?
What Russia?
Well, the idea, the cyber attacks that's coming, and the fact that we've sort of unleashed this, these great cyber attacks everywhere, that, everyone's the amount that's gone up during the pandemic. And we know that some of it, that there are some states involved in that. I mean, does that at some point become part of the terrorist threat?
Well, there was a conviction, I can't remember, not in the UK, but elsewhere, of someone sending Bitcoin to a terrorist group overseas. So you can obviously make use of the anonymity of the financial system that is now offered through cryptocurrency. So one might see more terrorist financing offences using that sort of architecture. When it comes to large-scale cyber attacks, well, ones that are carried out by states, they are, for good or bad, not regarded by the UK as being terrorism. So the UK has always drawn this quite odd line between what is a terrorist attack and what may look like a terrorist attack, but if it's carried out by state agents, is treated as hostile state agents, so hostile activity. So as you may know, new laws come into effect here. Schedule 3, which allows individuals travelling into the UK to be stopped and questioned without suspicion to see whether they're involved in hostile state activity. And the UK is obviously looking at that very carefully. But say the way that the UK looks at it is to draw a distinction between the two.
And one thing, sorry, I'm rather sort of jumping around, but just on your on those subjects you covered, it was also interesting on Shamima Begum. I thought of that you're obviously not quite at ease with that decision, and but that sense of, are people allowed to change? Can they reform? The idea of youth and how you treat sort of young people. I guess what happened at Fishmongers was that sense that we were all taken in, that you can't tell if someone is just you can't tell who you can trust and who you can't. Is there a sense that that it's with her, it's just more about where she seeks justice, or do you see that there's that something else is sort of happening where we where we need to feel that people are beyond redemption? We need terrorists to be bad in the long term.
Well, I think there is a really good but a broader point, which is, how do you avoid a ratchet effect? I mean, we're becoming increasingly sophisticated at spotting terrorist risk, or at least when there is an attack, we tell ourselves we should have spotted that terrorist risk, and next time we're not going to make the same mistake. But ultimately, prisoners are going to be released, even terrorists. The average sort of sentence for a terrorist offender is about 4 years, because very often people are convicted of what they call a precursor offence, so having the material on their computer rather than carrying out the attack. And we have to learn to live with people. And there's going to be plenty of people who can't be convicted. We have to hope they can be rehabilitated. And I think that it is important, as we have longer sentences, more sense of where the risk is, that we also develop tools that allow us to say, okay, we can now take the risk that we are not going to pile resources onto them, because counterterrorism policing is extremely expensive. It swallows up a huge amount of the budget. And there are lots of other threats out there which have nothing to do with terrorism at all. So I think being able to get off the escalator is also very important.
That is really interesting, and that sense of how targeted you are in your intelligence, or who you're following, or what you consider the priority in the threats, particularly, as you said, when the threats are becoming so sort of nebulous because they're caught up in behavioral psychological additions. Is there so what there is, I guess, is Prevent, and how effective do you think Prevent is and can be?
Well, I don't actually review Prevent. William Shawcross is the independent reviewer of Prevent, and so I'm not going to stamp on his ground. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing what he's got to say about it. I think that it's difficult. I mean, I think I've gone on record as saying that there are no magic bullets. I mean, that's an obvious point, but people talk often about an intervention as if it's over the horizon. I mean, it's very difficult, particularly if you've got, I gave the example of someone who's going home, shutting the door on the computer day in, day out, how you compete with that. Also difficult is, how do you compete if you've got a prison wing that has got a hierarchy involved around a tact offender? You may well have an hour session with a chaplain, but how's that going to compete if you're going back into the wing and people are pumping that same ideology? Same is true. There are some families, for example, who are well-known terrorists, and many members of their families have been involved in terrorist offences. How do you compete with that? So I think you've got to be realistic about what small interventions can do. And then for people who are very young and neurodivergent, or that there are different issues there, the same talking therapies, discussing, try and get people to unwrap their ideologies, may not work with people who've just formed a special interest.
So it is, would you say, more of a sort of battle for hearts and minds than than something you can do? Well, you talked about guns being dangerous here, but in terms of how you fight it, is it through? It seems to be more sort of therapeutic, the way that you're addressing some of the sort of problems, rather than, sort of hard and fast, fine them, lock them up?
No, I'm afraid I disagree. I don't think it is
Yeah.
therapeutic. I think that you have got to find terrorists, and you have got to be remorseless. And
when they're children, when they're sort of, when they're in danger of becoming terrorists, and what you do then?
Well, I'm afraid I think you do have to use terrorism investigative powers to see whether or not there's a risk. I mean, I would not be in favour of saying that you should not use counter-terrorism investigating powers against children full stop, because as we've seen, sadly, there are some children who will not just plot but actually carry out attacks. So I think you have to use these powers. The next question is what you do with them. And if you look at the guidance that the Crown Prosecution Service have for when it's in the public interest to prosecute people, there is a very good emphasis on whether or not it is in the public interest, bearing in mind someone's age. And of course, you've got to think about whether you want a child who is vulnerable to go into a prison environment. So, I mean, these decisions are being taken all the time, but I don't think I agree that it's about a therapeutic approach. I think it's about understanding risk, taking action on risk, but also trying to find what the most effective action is.
Yeah. And is there a sort of age of responsibility for children, would you say? That, what is it where you would say that they, you do have to intervene?
Well, risk is risk, isn't it? I don't think that risk is about liability. I mean, liability, being prosecuted for something, is a way of dealing with risk. But ultimately, you've got to look at the risk wherever it's coming from. I mean, I've never heard of a terrorist risk coming from a child of 9. But I suppose if a child of 9, which is below the age of criminal responsibility, had a gun, then they would be a risk. So you've got to look at the risk wherever it's coming from. It's just we have laws in this country saying that you can't prosecute people below a certain age.
And I've got some questions coming in now. One is, do UK intelligence agencies have sufficient legal powers to detect and preempt attacks? Are current powers properly balanced with protection of civil liberties, which was one of the themes of your lecture?
Yeah, I think so. The main, as the question will know, the main act is the Investigatory Powers Act 2016. I mean, that's very recent, and that was designed by one of my predecessors, David, now Lord Anderson, who had those sorts of considerations of the balance really at the heart of his analysis. I mean, he was a proper civil libertarian, but absolutely trusted and 100% understanding the nature of the risk. So I've seen no evidence. I mean, I've been doing this job for 2 years. I've seen no evidence that they lack the legal tools. Sometimes they lack the data. Sometimes they lack ways to share it. And one of the problems with, for example, prisons is how the highest, most sensitive grades of intelligence are shared with people who don't have the security clearance or the right computers. So there are difficulties in sharing, but in terms of legal tools, I think it's okay. And
again, did the pandemic affect any of that in terms of just sort of communication or being able to talk to different agents?
Yes, it did. I mean, in a way, it was a benign form. So the lowest security classification is official sensitive. And in a way, the pandemic, because people were working remotely, not using sensitive systems, meant that people had to try and learn to communicate at official sensitive levels. So using, for example, whatever we're using now, Zoom. And that is a good thing, because if you can find a way, if you're MI5 and you can find a way of communicating to the governor of the prison, the nature of the threat without blowing a source or a technique or something of that nature, that's a good thing. I mean, in terms of the pandemic, I think that it had a big effect and is still having a big effect on prisoners. Prisoners did not have the ability to circulate. It also had a big effect on travelling. So the numbers of travellers went down massively. That had an effect on the UK's ability to detect and disrupt, because travellers are a useful source of intelligence going in and out of borders. But equally, it means that fewer people came into the country.
So in a way, as we saw in other forms during the pandemic, as with crime, we saw it coming off the streets and perhaps going, into homes, that there was more sort of domestic violence. Is that sense of it being sort of, as it were, driven inside, and then the effects that had on. So you're looking at a whole different sort of type of possible terrorist is interesting. I do wonder what the link.
I mean, remember that the Reading attack took place during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people still are gathering in crowds, and they will be gathering more crowds.
Yeah.
So I mean, as I say, it's a temporary suppressive effect is how I put it.
Yeah. And the influence of sort of US culture, that, that sort of gun culture and so on. Why why do you think that's happening now? Is that still part of a kind of the Trump times, or where's that come from? The sense of, you know, the British people feeling sort of invested in US shooting culture.
I don't really know, but there's a right-wing chat, the memes, the humour, the iconography, the banter, that seems to have a really powerful effect. Why it's attractive, I don't know. I mean, you know, if you look at what happens in America, look at their domestic terror, although they didn't call it domestic terrorism, their domestic terrorism is very great. And of course, also in the US, it's not just right-wing terrorism, it's also the incels. So Elliot Rodgers, who is the famous incel murderer, mass murderer, and then Alec Manassian from Canada. So North America, mainly because of the presence of guns, is why they can carry out these mass casualty attacks, is influential. I suppose it's the kill count point, isn't it? People gamify, they want to have kills, they play their games, they play games where you have to kill lots of people, and when they see people doing that in America, I suspect that's a bit of a draw.
Gosh, again, it's sort of crossing that line, isn't it, between, you know, fantasy and reality? And do you see a certain demographic being affected, or a certain geographical span, or is there any way that one can do a sort of psychological profile of the type of person to be drawn into this?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be fascinated. I really don't know. I mean, obviously more white people now. I mean, a bit more white people being drawn into right-wing terrorism. I mean, it's not always the case, is it? If you take Daniel Hussein, you know, he was drawn into far-right stuff, but you know, more white people definitely being drawn into it. I haven't done the exercise. It'd be fascinating to know a regional breakdown of counter-terrorism arrests. I'll ask next time I speak to police.
Thank you. I've got a question from Lawrence Coles. Which country do you see being the biggest source of terrorist activity in the future?
Wow. Well, I suppose it's got to be, bearing in mind the current threat is the Islamist threat, it's got to be a country where Islamist terrorists are free to train and where people from this country are free to travel there and back. So, I mean, I've mentioned Afghanistan, Syria and Iraq, we don't know what's going to happen there. Also pockets of Africa as well. It's not just Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda's got a presence there, Islamic State is seeking to have a presence. So I think it's going to be those sorts of areas, but I don't know which precise country.
And what do you see the sort of international, you know, coordinated response to that? Because there's no great will to, you know, to go back in to any of those places, is there? I mean, the idea of a force going back into Afghanistan just is unimaginable.
Yeah, I mean, it seems a possibility of someone going in, a major force going in for a long time doesn't seem realistic at the moment. I mean, I just don't know. I don't know. I mean, remember the first impetus for all the invasions in Afghanistan was the terrorist threat. So I suppose one would have to see how it develops.
And I have another one, which is, rather than focusing on intervention, surely our equally important priority should be testing the theories of what conditions influence potential terrorists.
Yes. I suppose I'm a little bit skeptical of that, only in this respect. I mean, it's a really excellent question to ask, what leads to terrorism? But when people have asked that question, it often hasn't generated very useful answers. So you might have heard in the past about the conveyor belt theory, which is not now believed in. Another problem, and this goes into the review I'm doing in prisons at the moment, is that if one spends too much time trying to analyse, is that person really a terrorist? Or are they just a member of a gang who are doing that because they want to get access in prisons? You could end up taking your eye off the ball. And I almost think you should be a bit more simple about it. If you see something which you identify as a terrorist risk, then it's worth taking action. By all means, try and understand where it's going to come from and how terrorist they are, but don't allow it to divert you from taking action in the circumstances.
And since you know radicalisation is taking place in prisons, I mean, is there something more, you know, concerted and general one should do in tackling that?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I'm deep in the middle of writing my review, and I don't want to preempt what I'm going to say, but I've got a whole host of recommendations. There are definitely things that can be done. I mean, to be fair to the MOJ and the prison service, they are doing a lot at the moment. I don't think it's all completely right. They are putting a lot of time and investment in, and you know, I'm in deep consultation with them all the time at the moment. There's definitely things that can be done, and my report will come out and it will be published.
Oh, well, it'd be great to have you back when you write your report actually on that. And I have one more, which is what limit should be placed on the use of informants for the detection of potential terrorist risks?
Very few. I'm afraid that there are all sorts of objectionable covert techniques that we wish we didn't have to use, which exist. It's obviously important that they are properly authorized, that there is oversight, but they are a really useful source of information.
And where it's taking place in a state that doesn't observe the same standards that we might, is that does that worry you?
Well, I mean, I think that intelligence gathering is it's a pretty hairy business, isn't it? It's not my particular job, as it happens, to oversee it. I know the issues you're talking about, but I'm not going to go any further than that. My role is to look at the terrorist risk, but you're right. Of course, you're right to look at where information comes from, but that's not my role. That's a role for the Intelligence Service Committee, for IPCO, for others. But it's a fair point, and absolutely. I mean, this is perhaps goes back to the point we're talking about with counterterrorism powers. They are really powerful. They allow things to be done which are really intrusive, and so it's right that they should be exercised where it is terrorism or where it's suspected terrorism. And that's the difficulty with sort of Daniel Hussein type cases. Once you've decided that it is not terrorism, is it right to use these really strong powers?
And does the public have a sort of different view, again, just coming back to the pandemic, since we gave up a lot of liberty, freely and quickly? Has that sort of changed when you talk about the balance of risk between sort of safety and civil liberties? So we know that with public health. Is the same true of safety?
Well, I was worried when the recent Counter-Terrorism and Sentencing Act was going through Parliament. The government initially proposed that there should be enduring TPIM, so that's a sort of civil order that allows someone to be under house arrest, and that they should be potentially indefinite. And I publicly opposed it, and in the end, I think the government compromised on 5 years. My concern actually was that in the debates, the government might effectively say, "Look, we're all used to lockdown, and if we're used to lockdown on health grounds, why shouldn't we lock down a terrorist?" Although, in fact, that sort of terminology didn't in fact enter the debate. So I haven't seen, in fact, although I feared it might, I haven't seen that having an effect on our views of freedom versus preventing risk. It's a really good question, though.
Or the government's sense of overreach itself, of thinking it could exert powers there. It can do it in a different context.
No, I haven't seen it.
An enthusiasm for extra powers. And here's one from Lucy Fraser. Does the media treat terror incidents appropriately? Should they name, possibly inadvertently glorify terrorists? Perhaps better to give the IRA treatment?
Well, in I think it's Australia and New Zealand, ministers who are talking about terrorist attacks, and even judges, don't name terrorists. I take the opposite view. I'm afraid I just think that we have to talk about things, and if we don't talk about things, then terrorism legislation, which has to have public support, loses trust. We lose trust in the authorities, and there's less opportunity to test the authorities. And the authorities may get it wrong. I think it's right that media should have as much information as possible, and I've always seen that as part of my role, even though I know a lot of secret stuff. So I don't favour that myself. No. How they report it, I actually surprisingly, I'm really impressed by the people who cover terrorism. They're often very, very expert and very responsible in how they do it.
I'm sure some of them are listening now, so they'll be delighted to hear that. I suppose it comes back a little bit to is there a sort of glorification that can go on in the minds of the disturbed people that you're talking about, hence their wanting to copy some of the, Columbine or whatever, sort of seeing somehow that that will give them a glory or a legacy.
Possibly, but I mean, I can't see how one could suppress that.
No. I can't either. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and as I said, it'd be terrific if you came back, particularly to talk about prisons, since that does seem an area, you know, of where all this is being sort of played out. And we've talked a bit about, you know, that the sort of foreign dimension and the domestic dimension. Is there anything, you know, in terms of you know, what you would ask of the public, as it were, that, you know, playing their part at the moment, since we've, this has also been a time perhaps of sort of, you know, civic responsibility of is there a part that they should play?
Well, it's not for me to ask the public, but I mean, there is, I was really struck in the Manchester Arena inquiry. It's the fact that he looked like a suicide bomber and was acting like a suicide bomber. And I mean, it's regrettable that the security guard in question didn't have the confidence to go and tackle him, that the police weren't present, because that would have meant they might have felt more confident. But I mean, there is an element actually of the public just seeing what is there, and if they see something that is wrong, taking a step, because although when one has an inquest, the focus is quite rightly on the authorities and what the authorities could have done, ultimately there's only so many MI5 officers and counter-terrorism police. So I think it's about the public also seeing what's there in front of them.
And that was an interesting in that case, because it wasn't it also that he was worried about how he would be seen. You know, it might be seen as sort of, you know, racist or aggressive, or, you know, to actually say, what are you doing? Is there a sort of sense of people being more, you know, concerned by, you know, who the, I suppose what they might be doing is forming impressions of someone.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that Sir John Saunders in his report didn't refer to that, but I'll assume that was the case, that he was put off because he didn't want to be seen as Islamophobic. I think that is a factor, potentially. It's certainly a factor I've identified in prisons. There is sometimes a sense, I think, with prison officers that Islam, even terroristic behaviour in prisons, is a bit of a no-go area. So yeah, it's bound to be something that undermines confidence. I mean, that's why we have to keep talking about things.
And I suppose just finally going back to 7/7, you know, thinking of that sort of anniversary of you know, now that we can look back with some distance, are there, you know, could it happen again, or would we know now what the signs were, what to do, you know, in that sense of when to intervene, or do you see, you know, is that what kind of keeps you awake at night thinking? Could we do? Could
I mean, the truth is that anything can happen. But after the 2017 attacks, there was a huge attempt to deal with the question of people who were considered closed subjects of interest. That's what Mohammed Sadiq Khan was. He had been seen on the fringes of a plot, and he popped up again. I mean, one hopes that now that sort of thing would be picked up earlier on. But I mean, you're right. You know, you're right to make the point that it's impossible to stop all terrorist attacks, and there will be another one. I mean, at the moment, we've had many months now without a terrorist murder, and that's a very good thing.
Well, Jonathan Hall, thank you very much indeed for your time. As I say, we sort of welcome you back, and particularly welcome you at Bright Blue. And thank you for the organisers today, and for, you know, giving up their pre-football time. But it's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Bye.